Okay, I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast. I beat you to it.
Oh my goodness, got me. All right, so what are we looking at today, Rob?
Well, this was a lot in your call. You've been wanting to talk about this poet for a while.
I think he's interesting, yeah.
It's a Tang Dynasty poet, Li Shangyin.
Yeah.
When you talk about the Tang Dynasty, you typically have the biggies, Du Fu, Li Bai,
Wang Wei.
Wang Wei.
Sort of.
Yeah, he gets lumped in there, although I definitely have... Anyway.
And we've talked about him on podcasts before, but I don't know if those have been posted yet.
Yeah, I think a lot of them got lost in the shuffle, but which is sad because of their boundless genius that is now lost. So whatever. But the Tang Dynasty contained a huge number of poets.
Yeah, one of the most famous books I think in Chinese poetry is the Tang Shi Sanbai Shou, the Sanbai Shou, the 300 poems of the Tang Dynasty is kind of annotated, collected edition that is the gold standard of Tang Dynasty poetry.
There's no real analog in Western poetry. There's no real period that, the vast majority of people all say, this is it. Yeah. This is the high watermark for our poetry.
Yeah.
Anyway, Li Shangyin is not a poet I'm that familiar with.
And that's not actually that unusual. Li Shangyin, though I think if you talk to most educated Chinese people, they would know who he is and know some of his poems. But he's not, he's in the Tang Shi Sanbai Shou, but he's not really like a Du Fu or a Li Bai. He's very much sort of a poet that really was kind of ignored. Even in his time and shortly after, there wasn't that much attention paid to him, and a following has developed, but it is not quite up to the standards of Du Fu and Li Bai. This poem, actually, that we're going to take a look at is interesting because it's not even in the Tang Shi Sanbai Shou.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think it's a great poem. I was reading the Baidu commentary, if I can say that.
Yeah, the authoritative commentary.
But I was reading the Baidu commentary, and it says it's essentially so short, and there's not really enough meat on it to make it 可贵, like to make it very valuable or whatever. So,
and for those who don't know, Baidu is sort of the Chinese version of Google.
Yeah.
They even will say in Chinese Baidu xia, Baidu it.
Yeah, it literally is a knockoff of Google.
Yeah. So
Shanzhai Google. You know Shanzhai?
I don't know.
The knockoff version?
Oh, that's what that is.
Yep.
Okay, I was wondering. So, what's the name of the poem?
The name of the poem is Le You Yuan. So the title is actually, it's like happy playing plain. Plain is in Great Plains in Nebraska or whatever.
Yeah, you could also say le you, like happy traveling the plains, taking pleasure from traveling the plains, something like that.
And I don't know how much credence how much we should try and overinterpret the name, because that's actually the name of a real place outside of Chang'an.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's actually from the Han Dynasty on. So Chang'an is near modern day Xi'an, and that was where a lot of the imperial capitals were from the Han Dynasty to the Song Dynasty, really.
Which would take us from BC into the very AD,
exactly,
13th, 14th centuries.
Yeah. So this is a real place. It's about going to a real place where aristocrats used to go and hang out. Poets like to drink there and talk and write poetry there. But it's I don't know, that name seems to be asking for invitation. I don't know. Let's not overthink it.
Right.
So should we just go ahead and read it?
Dive in.
Okay. Do you want to read it?
I can read it. All right. So it's the first line is 向晚意不适驱车登古原.
And the second line.
Do you want to take the second line?
Or you go for it. Sorry.
夕阳无限好只是近黄昏.
非常好.
谢谢.
So I'm going to give it an attempt at a translation, if that's okay.
Sure.
So as evening comes, there's just something that's not right maybe I'm not, something about him is, his thoughts or his feelings, he's uncomfortable with something, but he doesn't say what. Driving my carriage, I mount the old plain. The sun at dusk, it's limitlessly beautiful or limitlessly great. Mm-hmm. It's only that it's nearing dusk. Mm. And I should point out, I translated both in the second couplet, both words as dusk, sort of dusk-like sun, and maybe, I guess the second dusk that I translated would almost be like a golden dusk.
Yeah, and there's a progression, a chronological progression, because the first two characters are Shangyin, which, if we were to read it in more modern sort of parlance, would be approaching, going towards evening. Yeah. And then the Xi Yang later is literally
Xi is dusk and Yang is sun. Mm-hmm. And Huang.
You could also read Xiangwan as sort of, it's getting late.
Yeah.
That'd be way too colloquial, but that's the idea. So it's worth pointing out here, too, for those who haven't read much Chinese poetry, very interesting fact that it's possible to write a poem without any pronouns or any stated subject. Here, we're reading it as I'm driving, I'm going, but there's actually no I anywhere here.
That's a great point. Yeah, it's not really clear what he's talking about. I mean, we assume because he's talking about someone's feelings that he is talking about himself, but that's really our own imposition.
And it's one thing, this is one of the reasons a lot of these poems are opened up to much broader interpretations, as in this could actually be a commentary on something very different, something bigger, because there's no stated I. If you have an I in the poem, I do, I see, you're reading it as this person's experience. But when that's taken away, this could be anybody. Mm-hmm. This could be thousands of people taking this trip. This could be one person. This could be a person millions of years ago. Who knows? Mm. It's this raw experience that can be read in many, many different ways.
And do you think that's possible in English poetry? Can we get away with that?
I don't know. It'd be a lot harder because in English, so many of our verbs require. You could do it. You could do it in a language like, well, it'd be harder, but technically, you could probably try it in French.
You could definitely do it in Japanese. I mean,
yeah, but a lot of languages you can use a verb and it assumes a subject because of how it's conjugated.
Yeah, Spanish you definitely could.
But when you have a language like Chinese where there is no conjugation. You can read it a lot of ways. So we were talking right before the podcast about, Li Shangyin comes after Du Fu and Li Bai.
And he's a huge fan of Du Fu. He's kind of part of the making of the cult of Du Fu, I would say. Du Fu at his time, and I think this is similar for Shakespeare, like no one thinks you're a god when you're alive.
Right.
No one thought Du Fu was really a god. It's my understanding. It wasn't until afterwards that he was deified as the
canonized
god.
Later,
canonized. Yeah. So Li Shangyin is part of that deification of Du Fu.
So because it's after Du Fu and Li Bai, and therefore it's after the Anlushan rebellion, which is the 8th century, this is at a point when the Tang is on its way out.
Yep.
I mean, it's still going to be a while. It's like the fall of the Roman Empire. It takes a while for it to phase itself out, but it's starting to crumble a lot from the inside as well.
There's a lot of corruption going on. There is, one of the things about the Anlushan rebellion is that the Tang imperial center had to recruit, essentially, military leaders out in the provinces to save themselves. And therefore, afterwards, they sort of kind of made a pact where a lot of the power that the Tang imperial center had up to the 750s when the Anlushan rebellion occurred, it goes out to the provinces. And this is kind of actually there's a long discourse of centralized power versus localized power in Chinese political history. Not all that different, I would say, from American.
And in fact, because of this rebellion and because of some of the border wars with groups like the Tangut, the early Song, which is after the Tang, deals with frankly, a lack of people to fill official posts in the bureaucracy because so many of them are gutted by wars, rebellions, infighting, warlordism, as we talked about it. So with that context...
Yeah, I mean, he's writing on the kind of cusp. I mean, the Song dynasty is not going to develop until really 100 years after his death.
Yeah.
But still, I mean, that's the context that he's writing in. It's kind of this slowly fading Tang dynasty.
Yeah.
And I guess the one of the ways that this poem has been read is that it's kind of like the swan song of the Tang dynasty. You know, you've got this incredibly beautiful sunset, and the last line means, you know, like, but that means night's coming on soon. That's the implication there.
Yeah, it's burning bright. You know, sunset is just so striking, and that's the image he's evoking.
Yeah.
The Wu Xian Hao, which is, I think, probably without limits beautiful, or limitlessly beautiful, or pleasurable, something. But it's sunset. Like, it is beautiful because it's sunset. Because as the sun is going down, you're seeing it. You're noticing it in a way you wouldn't have otherwise. And he's writing at a point when the culture of the Tang is doing the same. It's burning out, and he's seeing it burning out. But it's all the more beautiful because it's burning out.
And, I mean, I guess you could argue that if you read the poem that way, you could argue that he's suggesting that it's the most beautiful period. It's the best period in the Tang. But what comes next?
Yeah, exactly. But what's interesting about this poem, and a lot of poems like it in the Tang, is so you can read it this way, right? As an allegory of one form or another. You can also read it as we would read, say, romantic poetry in Europe, which is a reflection on the beauty and the power of nature. He's taking this, or whoever the speaker is taking this carriage or this coach up onto the plains for the purpose of seeing this thing. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, it's not even really clear that that's what he's doing. That's probably what he's doing,
right? But I mean, the point is simply that we don't know for sure if this is a literal he's going up and doing this thing, or if this is just him imagining it.
I think one of the interesting questions that you're hitting on, and with this idea of who it is and what's going on, and we don't know what exactly is happening, is what, I mean, he tells us at the beginning, at dusk, something, like my feelings were uncomfortable, or the
unsettled,
feeling... Unsettled, yeah, that's actually a better word, thank you. But we never learn why.
Right.
I think that's one of the geniuses of this kind of short poetry, is like, it's attributed to Hemingway, but it's supposedly the world's shortest story, the world's shortest short story. Baby shoes for sale, never worn, as a classified ad. Like that, the kind of like leaving on the table, allowing the reader of this poem to think, well, what is going on? Why is the yi bu shi? I think that's what gives it the sense that can later be interpreted. And we should point out that people at the time weren't saying the Tang is going to fall.
Right. We're dying.
And so there's a real problem with that interpretation.
Yeah, it's true.
Li Shangyin probably didn't. He wasn't like, this is the end, my friends.
Exactly. There's no Doors track playing in the background of this poem.
But the sort of ambiguity that not having any pronouns leaves, it totally could be that. And I think that's an interpretation that comes on much, much later.
Yeah.
He's not really that appreciated in his time, even shortly after his time. It's sort of Li Shangyin, it takes a while for an appreciation of Li Shangyin to develop. I believe most of the commentaries on him are actually not until the Qing dynasty, which is from 1644 to 1912. So that's, about 1,000 years after he has come and gone.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Like the Song commentaries, they have very short pieces on him.
So this is a fascinating poem and a good representative poem. And I would argue it's probably a good poem to be able to read in translation because of its concision and its very, very simple details.
Yeah.
It doesn't. There aren't really adjectives here. We don't have the stunning roseate sunset. It's just sunset. That's all it is.
And you're not missing all that much. I mean, obviously you lose something every time you translate it, but it's the commentaries that I read, the Baidu commentary,
of course,
they talked about how similar it was to spoken language. And that's one of the great things about this poem. It communicates this incredibly beautiful message in a very simplistic kind of language. I mean, I don't think it dumbs it down.
No, it doesn't. And this is the thing, though, that's so beautiful about some of this Tang poetry is that it, and Du Fu will do this occasionally with very colloquial language, communicate something that everyone can relate to. And like you say, it's when you start out simply by saying, I am unsettled, or it is getting late and feelings are unsettled, that's a very common response a lot of people have at sunset. There's something about that time of day that's melancholy. Night is coming, you know. Everyone can relate to this. And there's a way in which the best poetry of the Tang taps into this with almost no embellishment at all. If European Romantic poetry is notable for some of its language, its eloquence, the Tang can be, at times at least, notable for almost the opposite, for its concision and its colloquialism.
Yeah, it's very kind of Hemingway-esque in that sense. Just get rid of all that extra language. I think that's about it. It's a fairly short poem. It's only 20 characters long, so there's not... You know, I mean, I'm sure we could spend hours talking about it, but I think we've kind of exhausted it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. Read it if you can find it.
Yeah, see if you can find a copy online. Maybe we'll put up some English translations on our site.
Yeah, okay. Sure.
Great. I think that's it. I'm Lee.
I'm Rob.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.